Vítam hlavného našeho hostia Michaela Ignatieva a jeho manželku Žužanu. Tak poďte. Ospravedlňujem Žaka Rupníka, ktorý mi dneska napísal, že ochorel a nemohol prísť, ale vítam našich panelistov. Terezou Matějčkovou. A keď už sa usadili, tak odovzdám slovo Michaelu Žantovskému, ktorý bude nás prevádzať týmto programom.
Dobrý večer, dámy a pánové. Slyšíte mě? Jo. Je vždycky milé být v knihovně Václava Havla a zvláště milé při takové vzácné příležitosti, kdy vítáme významného kanadského a troufám si říct světového myslitele, autora, politika a pedagoga Michaela Ignatieffa. Výčet jeho prací a jeho akademických funkcí by trval velmi, velmi dlouho a my zase tolik času nemáme, ale měl bych přinejmenším zmínit, že jeho alma mater je University of Toronto, že učil na Harvardu, učil na Oxfordu, byl předsedou kanadské liberální strany a naposledy jsme se vídali, a to dost často, když Michael byl rektor a prezident Středoevropské univerzity v Budapešti a o tom možná poví on sám víc. Ten dnešní večer je věnován knize, která se jmenuje O útěše, on consolation. Je to kniha nesmírně zajímavá a troufám si říct, že poněkud odlišná od standardních esejistických knih, které poznáváme a čteme, ale asi nejlepším úvodem do té knihy bude, když o ní něco řekne Michael sám a pak poprosím Terezu, aby k tomu řekla něco strašně chytrého a pak já k tomu řeknu něco méně chytrého a pak si budeme povídat, jo? A pak budete mluvit vy teda, jo? Takže, Michael, the floor is yours.
What do I have to do? Oh, I have to
speak. Yeah.
I have to speak. I wish I could speak you in your native language, but my Czech is very disappointing, so I won't try. It's an honor to be with this guy. It's an honor to be in the Havel Library. An important chapter of this book is about Václav Havel. And so it's especially meaningful to me to be in this place. And it's very nice to be with Tereza, who is going to give me a very hard time. She's a philosopher. What is this book about? Consolation is a very old-fashioned word. It's one of these words that's almost dropped out of the language. For millennia, however, it was a religious word that captured all our longing to be saved, to be redeemed, to find meaning in our suffering. And when we lost somebody we loved, to meet them again in heaven. And so for millennia, in the Protestant faith, the Muslim faith, the Jewish faith. Consolation carried all our hope that our pointless, endless suffering would be redeemed in another world. And we are still the children of those traditions. I'm not religious, although my father was Russian Orthodox, because we're from Russian refugee family. And he found comfort and consolation in the Russian Orthodox churches of exile throughout his life. And so the closest I ever came to understanding religious consolation was just watching my father pray in these churches. So we're the heirs of this tradition, even if we no longer believe. And I think we are less secular than we say we are. We are still haunted by this language of salvation. But we are also the heirs of the rebellion against consolation. The rebellion begins in the European Enlightenment with people like Condorcet, the great French mathematician and philosopher, basically saying, we are being strangled by the religious promise of salvation, which promises hope in another world, and we need hope in this one. And we cannot have hope in this world unless we free ourselves from the chains that this false promise of religious consolation has cast on our minds. From Condorcet it goes to Marx, from Marx it goes to Lenin. This tradition of rebellion against consolation is a very strong part of our inheritance as well. Many of you will know the Dylan Thomas line, rage, rage against the dying of the light. Do not go gentle into the good night. That fury that we cannot have happiness and hope in this life, it must always be deferred to some imaginary world beyond. So, this book is an attempt to tell stories about the religious traditions of consolation, to take them seriously and with respect, and also chart and take seriously and with respect the rebellion against consolation. And to conclude that we can't do without consolation. Because we suffer. We lose people we love and can't understand why. Because we have political hopes for a better world that are constantly disappointed. And we need to be consoled for these losses, by which I mean we need to find meaning for these losses so they don't just seem senseless, pointless. If you contrast two words, you begin to see how difficult consolation is. The two words are comfort and consolation. if I comfort Tereza, I don't have to say anything. I can just be with her. And hopefully, if we are good friends, our presence would make her feel less miserable, if I'm doing it right. If I want to console Michael, I have to give him words that confer meaning of some kind on his suffering and his experience. Comfort can be physical and nonverbal. Consolation has to confer meaning on experience. And this is what's difficult. The book begins with a little story of sitting with a very dear friend of mine in Budapest who had just lost his wife of 55 years. What do you say to a man who's lost a wife he loved and they've been together for 55 years? What do you say? This was a moment when you encountered why consolation is nearly impossible. And so, I will stop now, but why I am fascinated by consolation is we don't believe in the promise of religious salvation, but we can't do without it. We desperately need consolation because life is hard. And yet, it is the most difficult exercise of solidarity in human life. It's at the edge of what language can do. It's at the edge of what human beings can do for each other. And that's why I wrote the book. So we'll stop there.
Tak já myslím, že jsme byli domluveni na češtinu, že jo, že mám, jo. So I will talk because we agreed on, okay. Já moc děkuji za pozvání. Velmi si toho vážím v kontextu tak krásné knihy, kterou bylo opravdu pro mě potěšení číst. Chtěla bych zdůraznit to, co jste tady řekl v závěru, že v nějakém ohledu je útěcha na prahu jazyka, na prahu možná bolesti a mně se vlastně na té knize připadalo pozoruhodné. Já řeknu jenom pár vět, co mě zaujalo velmi na té knize. Vlastně skepticismus vůči náboženství, skepticismus vůči filozofii, aspoň jsem ho tam také zaznamenala, a skepticismus nakonec i vůči tomu skepticismu, protože ani to nemůže být v nějakém smyslu poslední slovo. A vy jste tady vlastně v tom úvodním expoze zdůrazňoval, že sám nejste věřící a v nějakém ohledu i, že my vlastně jsme v nějakém ohledu už nejsme odrozenci náboženské tradice přirozeně. Už mnozí z nás nevěří a zároveň, že se s touto tradicí zcela nemůžeme rozejít. Zároveň teda, aby to nevypadalo tak, že vlastně ta kniha je nějak náboženská. Jo? Ona je, tam zaznívají třeba citát, že Davida Humea, že chyby v případě filozofa jsou pouze směšné, v případě náboženských myslitelů jsou zločinné často. Takže tam máme vlastně jako důraz vlastně na to, že náboženství, náboženská zkušenost nám může dát rámec, v rámci něho, rámec, který nás vede k porozumění tomu, že něčeho, co si myslím, že se nyní ztratilo, že trpět je nějak normální a že utrpení je něco, co nás často spíše spojuje, než rozděluje a něco, že jsme si vlastně nějakým ohledu trošku namluvili možná a i proto často tolik trpíme, že bychom vlastně jako trpět neměli a chápeme to jako nějakou třeba až kosmickou urážku. Tak to mi připadá vlastně důležitý, že to náboženství nám skýtá rámec, který nás uzemňuje v tom utrpení, to asi za prvé. A potom ještě mi přišlo opravdu krásné to, jakým způsobem jste pojal Cecil Saundersovou, zakladatelku hospicového hnutí, kde vlastně se ukazuje, že útěcha není jenom něco, co se můžeme naučit, přečíst někde a potom to odvyprávět, ale když ona skýtala útěchu umírajícím, tak jeden umírající jí řekl, když už jí došly citáty z Bible a žalmy, které uměla nazpaměť a chtěla sáhnout po Bibli, tak jí jeden umírající řekl, ne, raději opakujte ty, které znáte vy nazpaměť, které máte zniterně, ne. A takže vlastně, že to nebyl jenom jako rámec, že my jsme věděli, k jakým slovům přirozeně sáhnout a jak my jsme uměli nabízet útěchu. A potom vlastně ti filozofové, který vy jste si tam vybral, v nějakém smyslu jsou často velmi podvratní. To je David Hume, to je Michel de Montaigne, to je Albert Camus, myslitel absurdity. To znamená filozofové, kteří si to nechtějí s útěchou vůbec usnadňovat a zároveň právě už ale nabízí přece stejně nějaký slovník nový a to schopnost vykázat, uznat utrpení, ale vykázat ho do nějakých mezí. To znamená neoddat se, nechtít se definovat skrze utrpení, nebo se mi zdálo, že právě tyto myslitele jste tam vlastně vybíral. Myslitele, kteří jako Cicero nakonec zdůrazní, že musíme bolesti vymezit nějaké pole působnosti, abychom se k ní mohli vztáhnout, abychom ji mohli třeba také prožít, protože bolest a utrpení má schopnost nás zcela pohltit, ale vlastně filozof je schopen nepodlehnout příliš ani bolesti, ani extázi. To bych řekla, že ti filozofové, které vy jste tam zmínil, že vlastně drží tuto jako linii, určitě i skepticismus vůči bolesti. Je tohle opravdu poslední slovo a filozofové jsou skeptičtí, tak řeknou třeba ne, tak pojďme to ještě zkusit ještě jeden den. A pak mi tam ještě se líbila jedna taková polemická rovina, která se mi zdála, že byla přítomná a co je něco, co já nemám tak dobře sformulované jako vy, ale chtěla bych si to taky pro sebe sformulovat a to, že mi osobně vadí to, že se zdá, že skutečně my jsme přišli o jazyk útěchy a vy jste říkal, už je to slovo, které vlastně třeba už mu ani tak nerozumíme a že místo toho jsme přijali, zdá se mi často, psychoterapeutický slovník, který jsme hodili na celou společnost a vlastně čteme události, lidi, často kteří o to vůbec nestojí, skrze nějaké psychoterapeutické termíny, skrze různá opravdu až psychiatrizující slovník, psychoterapeutický slovník. A ten slovník určitě má své místo, má své oprávnění a my jsme se jim nechali, zdá se, příliš zahltit a je třeba, a tu vaši knihu chápu jako příspěvek k tomu, pojďme se ještě zamyslet, jestli jsme v momentě, kdy máme jenom jeden slovník, tak možná o něm míme. A ještě ten psychoterapeutický slovník není, zdá se mi, nejbohatší možný. A vlastně to nebezpečí identifikovat se, definovat se skrze trauma, nebo skrze vlastně bolest, je něco, co myslím, že je silný téma, který vy jste přinejmenším v úvodu velmi hezky vyzdvihl a potom i ve vašem polemickém podání Sigmunda Freuda, nebo nechci to přehánět, ono není polemické, ono je velmi jako citlivě pojaté, ale cítila jsem tam určitý osten vůči, ale ne možná vůči Freudovi, ale vůči té otravné expanzivnosti tohoto slovníku. A závěrem úplně myšlenka, která mě nejvíce zaujala a ten závěr je krásný a mně se tam hrozně líbila, hrozně ošklivě řečeno, moment toho, kdy zdůrazňujete, že stárnutí, v tom jedeme všichni, ve stáří ještě ne, ale stárnutí. Tak stárnutí skýtá obrovskou naději v tom, že odkládáme ten mylný pocit vlastní výjimečnosti, který často jsme tak jako třeba se do něj vžili během nějakých příznivějších momentů a nebo díky některým darům a najednou vlastně postupně zjišťujeme, že spíše do toho světa a do těch mezilidských vztahů klesáme, nejsme ničím výjimeční a je to vlastně fajn, protože se můžeme cítit blíže třeba druhým. Tak to mi připadal vlastně jako pozoruhodný motiv, který jsem takto neviděla v žádné knize rozpracovaný. Děkuji.
Teresa said a number of extremely interesting things about Freud, for example. Gustav Mahler went to Leiden in desperation in 1908. And he and Freud walked up and down a canal in Leiden in Holland. And Mahler tried to get Freud to explain to him why he was so miserable. And I tell that story. Freud didn't believe in consolation. He believed in converting hysterical misery into common unhappiness, was his famous phrase, and believed in psychoanalysis as a kind of rational mastery and coming to terms with suffering. And as Teresa said, there's a great deal to be said for that. And I don't think Freud ever converted suffering into illness or felt that suffering was just illness. Some forms of suffering are experienced as illness. They just overwhelm you. But someone like Mahler, and if you listen to his music, and I have a chapter about the Kindertoten Lieder, the songs he wrote about the death of children, you see a vision of suffering which is much deeper, more powerful, and more strange than the simple idea that it's illness. And I think you're right. One of the themes of the book is to try and enlarge the vocabulary we have to think about suffering and to pull it away from the psychoanalytic dominance of this subject, which tends to make us think of our suffering as if it was an illness from which we could be cured by a therapy. And the language of consolation is anti-therapeutic in the sense that it it thinks there isn't a therapy for some suffering. There are simply things you have to endure and give meaning to. And Mahler's Kindertotenlieder is one of the greatest examples I know of an artist giving meaning to suffering. So that's one theme. I think the other theme that I would want to stress to this audience, because you haven't read the book, is that it's a book of stories. It's not a book of philosophical analysis. It's a book of stories. Let me give you an example. I try to put the ideas that a philosopher has, or a writer has, or a politician has, into the middle of their lives and try and understand where their writing and understanding came from. I'm actually not interested in Stoicism, for example. I'm interested when Stoicism collapses. My example is Cicero. Tremendous, proud, arrogant politician, rhetorician, philosopher, who is famous for spreading this idea of masculine self-control and mastery in relation to suffering. And then his daughter dies. His daughter dies. And I'm interested in the letters that that Cicero then wrote when his daughter dies, because his life falls apart. Here's a man who has tried to teach people the idea of Stoic self-mastery, of grief, faced with actual grief, collapses. These are the moments I'm interested in. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man of his time, writes the Meditations, and you may have been asked to read them as young people because they are the great Stoic text. I'm interested in the Marcus Aurelius who is fighting a bloody counterinsurgency war on the Danube frontier and is writing these texts at night because, as the most powerful man in the world, he can't talk to anybody. He can't trust anybody. So he confides his secrets to the page. And I read the Meditations as his attempt to console himself for being lonely, tired, exhausted, and depressed by having to fight a war that he never thought he'd have to fight and fears he will lose. Well, when you see him that way, the text is transformed. And I have the same things to say, and I won't go into it, about Václav Havel. The Havel I'm deeply interested in is the Havel in prison in the early 80s, writing to Olga and putting himself through a kind of deep inner analysis of an extremely painful kind. And it's one of the moments where I come out admiring him deeply. But the whole book is like that, an attempt to find the moments, the hinge moments in a life when you suffer and you have to find meaning for it somehow. And so it's one story like that after another. And as you say, it ends not with a philosopher, but with a wonderful woman. A woman called Cicely Saunders, who may not be known to you. She was a British nurse who invented something you will know about, which is called the hospice. The places you go when a hospital can't give you any more therapy, and it's a place where you go to die. And what she understood about consolation is to be consoled, you need to have a place and you need to have time so that you can make peace with your loved ones, you can make peace with yourself. And here's the most interesting thing. You can console others by the manner in which you die. You can give hope to others by the manner in which you die, by saying to them, in the way you die, don't be frightened. And that's, to me, one of the most powerful things that I learned from writing my own book, was listening to this extraordinary woman. So that's to give you some idea what the hell is between the pages of this thing. Anyway, sorry. Thank you, Teresa, for your thoughts.
Well, thank you, Michael. It's a wonderful book. I will confess that I haven't been moved by a book in some time, and this is a moving book. This is a book that has moved me, and I suppose that was your intention. Just the same, I will prod a little. Sorry? I will prod a little. Have a problem? Yeah, no, I will prod a little. Oh, yeah, prod. You made a distinction in your introductory remarks between comforting someone and consoling someone. And it has occurred to me that in Czech language we don't really have a word for this distinction. You know, for us it's comforting, consoling, it's utěšit, or something like that. And that made me think whether we do not attach too much emphasis to the language. We had this discussion with Teresa once, and I will confess to my spots. I'm a psychologist by training, but not a therapist by training. And and there are so many ways we express ourselves and communicate to others without using the words. And I feel there is a significant part of the process of consolation, of consoling, which is extra verbal. And, you know, I think it's no accident that you start the book with psalms, you know, which have a religious meaning and a religious content, but also a very strong aesthetic meaning, especially when put to music. Yeah, and you mentioned Mahler. You know, there's so much consolation in music. And I personally, in some of my most difficult moments, it's music. I go to find some sense of the moment. So, you know, I maybe we should have pity on music and beauty and things of that kind, which help us in consoling ourselves. Then, you know, I will rather skip the chapter about Marx. I think you much too kind to Marx. You know, in this country it's not surprising, you know, but you know, he was not such a humanistic model as we sometimes believe him to be. His marriage to Jenny was not as ideal as people think, and I think sometimes we find too many excuses for him in his early incarnation, but Communist Manifest is not an early Marx, and it's all in there, including the violent overthrow of the system, etc., etc. I think it should stick to Marx. But I was much amused when I was reading, and when I had you described it now, the story of Mahler and Freud. For the uninitiated, the problem that Mahler went to Leiden to speak to the famous professor was impotency, right? I mean, he was going through very difficult times with Alma Mahler, his wife, and so he went to Leiden. And Freud, who believed his whole teachings are about spending 3 or 4 years with a patient to discover his early infantile traumas and help him rediscover himself, spent, 2 hours with Mahler, and then send him packing, and not just that. I mean, when Mahler died, not too long afterwards, he sent a bill to Mahler's heirs to pay for the 2 hours of psychoanalysis. So
it's not a good story.
I'm a little cynical about. It's a wonderful story. I love it. I can. But it just shows that the days of the talking cures are slightly over in my discipline, and in this country we still believe that dynamic therapy is the best discovery since the invention of the wheel, but it's not. I mean, the discipline has moved on and is much more sophisticated about our problems. But the last question I have to you, and I'm perfectly unable to solve it, is the link, the connection between consolation and meaning. Yeah, because you start with scholars and philosophers who, because of their religious convictions, had a very strong idea about the meaning of life, etc., etc. But near to the end, with Camus and even with Havel, you encounter people who questioned, the meaning. Havel, like Camus, was a playwright of the absurd, and he had a very strong sense of the world as an absurd place. Yet he, in the quote about hope that you use, and in his other writings, he certainly aspired to a meaning beyond the horizon of our everyday life, and so on. And when I sometimes asked him about this and the seeming inconsistency of it, he said it's like figure and background. You can only see meaning against the background of total absurdity. And it stayed with me, and I think it was one of the more profound things he's ever said. So, on to you.
Boy, it's good to come to Prague. This is given me lots to think about. I won't take you on about Marx. That's another conversation. But
I didn't think.
The question of meaning is, I think, what we need to think about. I think it's very important that Camus and Havla shared this sense, deep sense, of the impossibility of giving a kind of metaphysical meaning to existence. But both of them, I think, had a passionate sense that we make meaning through moral action. That is, it's not bloody obvious what the universe is for or what we're for, but it's perfectly clear what we should do, what we ought to do. And that's why the famous quote about hope is so important, that, you know, hope is the conviction that we should do the right thing whether or not it comes out well. This is not a statement that we're in an absurd universe. This is a statement that the human world, the only world where we can have determinate and clear responsibilities, those responsibilities are clear. Those duties are clear. And Havla, whatever you think about his political life and his personal life, understood that there was meaning to be had here. There was betrayal to be had here. There was, you know, it was a perfectly meaningful world. And I think it's in that purely human world that we console ourselves or find consolation or don't find consolation. I don't think we find any more. I think this may have dropped away from us. I don't think we seek a consolation in a grand metaphysical order. We don't think, our suffering is part of a cosmic plan. I think we think, let's share it. Let's try and find some way to communicate what we're experiencing about our suffering. And the communication of it is crucial to the possibility of consolation. That's why words matter. I feel terrible. Here's why I feel terrible. You say, well, I felt terrible. Here's what here's how I understand the meaning of feeling this bad, etc. And we go back and forward. It's recursive, and out of this exchange, we develop not an ultimate meaning about suffering, but some sense of sharing something and producing a meaning that helps in some way. That I think that's all I mean. And I think it's also the case, and this is why I devoted a chapter to Mahler, that the nonverbal is terribly important. I mean, I begin the chapter on Mahler not about Mahler, but with a story about Beethoven, a famous story about Beethoven, that Beethoven knew a woman who played his sonatas. She was a noble woman with a young family, and she was a wonderful pianist, and she lost her child. And she was, as we say, inconsolable, silent, unable to even feel emotion for the loss of her child. She was locked up inside. And she was extremely disappointed that her friend Beethoven didn't come to see her. And then one day he just showed up, went over to the piano, and improvised for an hour. And she said in a famous letter, this was the first moment where I was able to feel anything. He improvised for an hour, and because it's Beethoven, closed the piano, got up, tapped her on the hand, and walked out. And not a word was exchanged. because no word needed to be exchanged. It had been this communication through music. So the meaning is a constellation is a social process, a human process, a human exchange. And sometimes all you can do is comfort. But sometimes I think you can come through with a sense of creating a frame that makes the experience meaningful. The other thing I'd say, and I'm sorry to go on so long, but one of the purposes of the book was to say, we find meaning in space, you and me, Teresa and me, now, talking to each other. But we need to remember that we have a dialogue in time, backwards, to the dead. All of these people in this book are dead, and yet I felt when I was in their company that I was communicating directly with the departed souls. I was trying to understand how it was that they'd written what they wrote, how it was that they understood their suffering. And that sense of a community through time is, I dare say it, the most important message I'm trying to communicate. You are not alone. You have never been alone, right? We have a repertoire in just the Western tradition that goes back, 5,000 years. And if you lose the sense that you have a repertoire of meaning through time, you forgo one of the crucial sources of consolation that our culture has to offer. And no one is saying, least of all me, that this is the repository of all the consoling words you can find in the Western tradition. Absolutely not. And no one is saying that the only tradition is consoling is the Western tradition. Absolutely not. It's all I know, that's all. But that sense of a continuity through time is, to me, especially in the times we're living in now, which are very dark, extremely important.
Indeed. Terezou?
So I will switch to English as well. Maybe I will just comment on the fact both of you mentioned that somehow we have lost the metaphysical arc or metaphysical horizon, and you very well stressed the fact that consolation can be an interpersonal issue as well. So it's not something far away, but something one can offer to someone. But I think hope is as well someone you can take away from someone. And I think this is as well an important topic of the book, that we should take care of we should take care of the ability of others for hope, and that quite often you said it, we live in dark times, we tend to be very pessimistic, and as well our entire culture is quite often built on the idea we have to insure ourselves for the future, so we are expecting bad things to happen, and then we glean some form of happiness from the fact that they did not arrive. But I think because part of the title is the word hope as well, hope in dark times. And here theology can help once again, because theology knows three virtues, and hope is one of the virtues. And hope in this context does not mean that it is something that is given to me, but something that I need to practice. And so I need to practice as well the ability to expect that something good might happen. And if I don't practice this ability, maybe I won't be able to see it, and maybe I won't be able to encounter it, even though it happens all the time. So sometimes I don't want to overrate it, but so we tend to focus on the negative side, but we need some form of insurance for the good as well. So to be and hope is this, I think, sensitivity for good things that happen, for good people we encounter. And one last thing, maybe, because you, Michael, mentioned Havel and this idea of, and I think Havel is here very important, not, of course, it's here very important figure, but as well his kind of thought, because he really struggled for meaning through his often absurd positions and intuitions that meaning is not something we easily glean from the world. So, and I often think about an interview he led with Karel Hvížďala, and Karel Hvížďala asked him, well, while you were in prison, did you ever think about suicide? And Václav Havel said, well, of course, all the time. People all the time think about suicide, and that's why they don't do it. They don't commit it because they know that, well, if the situation gets really bad, still I can commit suicide. And I'm sorry, it's a little bit brutal maybe, but I think there is a very important point here that against the background of this against the background of this extreme, once again, this extreme, this negative extreme, can be used in a way that bestows not only meaning to today, not to a metaphysical perspective, because now I will, okay, today I will try, and tomorrow we will see. But I think this was important for both. So against this extreme, you can reach through this extreme something very positive and something you can use in your everyday life. And I think this is where both Camus and Havel actually very much meet in this position, and I think it's an interesting one.
One remark on Havel, on this, when Karel Hvížďala interviewed him for the book, we didn't know yet what we know today about Havel, and since that time we discovered some of his diaries during his first incarceration, and also the text he wrote, and after in 1977, after he signed the charter and went to prison for the first time, and then he hid it somewhere and wrote, it will be never found again. It was found again. It was published by the library a couple of years ago. And these notes make quite clear, and I think it underscores your point, that there was one time when he seriously considered suicide, and that was during the first imprisonment, when he felt he failed, he felt morally, and he thought it was irreparable, irrevocable, and that the hope is gone. And that's, when the hope is gone, that's the moment when you get these thoughts. Fortunately, he didn't. Yeah.
You still can delay it to the other day.
Yeah. Yeah, we should, before there's this terrible line by Woody Allen. He cites Emily Dickinson, hope is the thing with feathers. and he writes, no, the thing with feathers is my cousin, I have to take him to a specialist. Okay, so on this lighter note, we'll end here on the stage, and the floor is yours now. I can see the first hand and the second hand, so we will start in the front. Mr. Palouš here is...
Thank you very much. If you allow me to make two corrections. I think that there is a very specific Czech tradition of consolation of philosophy in the 20th century. So it's not only something way back in the past, but I think we have it our present situation. The author of the most famous Consolatio Philosophiae was Emanuel Radl, a biologist and philosopher, a big spiritual personality in the 1920s, 30s, published a lot of books, and he was somewhere between Masaryk critical realism, never positivist, maybe vitalist or something. And then obviously, in the end of his life, he got ill and Czechoslovakia was gone. So he published his Consolatio Philosophiae. He passed away in 1942, I believe. And I think this book was a very big inspiration for philosophers like Ladislav Hejdánek, because he was a member of Czech Brethren, this Protestant church. And Havel. What you might want to look at also is that they were not only letters from prison, but letters to prison that were also published here by the library. Yes. And it was initiative of Václav's brother Ivan, who tried to send him some inspirations, some philosophical thoughts. So it was a kind of dialogue, and Václav Havel had an opportunity to process these ideas coming from the outside in his own way in prison. Yes. And this man, who was that friend mentioned here, was a Catholic philosopher, Zdeněk Neubauer, and he was actually asked by Havel to write an introduction to this edition 16 Letters from Prison. It was a bold move because Václav was still in jail. It was published in samizdat, and obviously it would have had implications for his status in prison. And after that, because Neubauer was a very eloquent Catholic, the question was whether Havel got seduced or almost baptized in the Catholic way by these inspirations. My answer is no. Václav Havel had his own religion, and it really reminds me what was in the old times Boethius in the 6th century. He also was later baptized by Justinian or I don't know whoever, but I don't think that his Consolatio Philosophiae had too much to do with religion. It was some sort of political resistance to the situation in his time.
You've given me a lot of work to do. I think you're making all I can say back is that it helps me to understand the extent to which Havel's own search and struggle was anchored in a Czech tradition of which I didn't know as much as I could have done. But I'm very aware of the letters that came in to prison. They were extremely important in triggering and focusing and helping his thought. But I wasn't aware of the specifically Czech context. So that's extremely helpful. Thank you.
Tak, tam, ne, paní vzadu, já to musím brát tak střídavě a nalevo, napravo, gender.
Thank you very much. Thank you, you all the speakers. Thank you very much. And I have a question for Professor. It is an honor to see you here. I'm very much looking forward to read the book. And so I was considering two questions. how to take it, to do it short. Firstly, you already talked a lot about meaning, but one of the very first sentence you said was that we need to give meaning to loss. And I was thinking, well, loss already implies certain meaning, because loss is we lost something important, right? So my question would be, what is the relation between the meaning implied in loss and the meaning we give to loss by consolation? I hope it is not too schematic, or it might sound trivial, but I do think there might be some point in it. And the second question was rather polemic. Maybe it's just a joke, but again, we give meaning to all sorts of things, and there were also presented several kinds of meaning, moral meaning and all that. And so I might ask, so are we losing something by putting or applying meaning to laws? Thank you.
Boy, this is difficult. Yeah, I'm hearing that you're a philosopher, and I think I've got to declare that I'm not a philosopher. I'm a sort of historian of ideas, I guess. But so I'm immediately out of my league. And Teresa, you're going to have to step in and rescue me here. I think I'm not going to answer your question well, but what I hear is the gulf that exists between the meanings that are available to us in language or philosophy or whatever, and the loss itself. My brother died before Christmas. He was 3 years younger, and he had a miserable last year. And I was very aware when he died that a whole set of meanings kind of flooded into the space. But it was kind of up to me to choose whether any of those had anything to do with what he went through. And I had to think, and it was a test of truth, this is a terrible thing to say, whether I felt anything at all. Don't get me wrong, I loved my brother, but I didn't like him very much. I don't mean to defame his memory, and I regret his loss. But the feelings you have in these things it's very turbulent. There's the thing itself, and it comes with this penumbra of metaphor and what you're supposed to feel and what you're supposed to say. And I think one of the things that was very helpful, because I'm not religious, was going to the church that he had attended very faithfully, a little basement church. We had to get the coffin down the stairs into the basement of this church. We went through the whole ritual. It was a Russian Orthodox church in a community in Toronto. They didn't sing very well, but they sang, damn it, and they did their best, and I could remember the Orthodox liturgy. And I was aware then that part of the wisdom of these traditions is that they say, stop worrying about what this means. Just sit there and let us do this. They didn't even ask me to believe all of it. They just said, leave it to us. And little things like, they said, Mr. Ignatieff, do you want to have an open coffin or a closed coffin? You have to understand that in our tradition, the coffin is open. And I thought about that. My brother, when he died, was very bashed up for medical reasons and didn't look great. But it ended up being marvelous that the coffin was open. I can't tell you why. And perhaps that was a moment when the reality of his loss, the physical reality of his loss, became very salient. So we struggle to find a meaning that is properly ours, that we have authored, that is true to our experience, and it's a tremendous struggle. There's loss, and then there are the metaphors, there are the stories, and part of the business of, forgive me, living in truth is always asking what is true for me. And when you find what is true for you, I think you can be consoled.
Okay, now we go back front.
Thank you. I have a question I wanted to ask you for years already. I have been studying at CU when Lex CU came in, and the university under your leadership defended itself. And I think on the level of students, our resistance will be completely forgotten in the next Hungarian generation. And I think we should have and could have done better job in the best tradition of student protesting. And my question is this. Don't you think that very often the consolation could be rather seen as a sort of artificial painkiller which one seeks after having failed to act very decisively? I think, I want to say last sentence, I think about it as I saw it from the level of a normal student. I haven't seen anything. I think you did a great job in the level of high political debates, and I think we students failed under your leadership to really give some kind of remarkable symbols of students protesting against such an ignorant, populist attack at your university.
Boy. I think there is a sense in which for example, in common English, we say you get the consolation prize. That's the prize you get when you lose. And you console yourself with phrases like, we fought the good fight. We fought Orban as best we could, but we lost. We say things like, it was an honorable defeat, right? And one of the reasons I'm interested in consolation is that it is a very powerful source of what Marx would have called false consciousness. That is, you console yourself for failure when, in fact, you should perhaps be much angrier about failure and much less reconciled to failure. We lost the battle against Viktor Orban. We fought it as hard as I thought. I think you're being much too hard on the students and you. I felt as the leader of this campaign, or a person at the front, that I had magnificent support from students throughout. So I wouldn't feel bad about that. But I think all of us, and I think Havel was very attuned to this, you should never be easy on yourself in defeat. You should be extremely critical. You should refuse false consolation. I was in politics and was defeated. I lost very badly. And you have to look at that defeat very carefully and not console yourself, not pat yourself on the back and say, well, I gave it a try and at least I put my name on a ballot and I wasn't sitting on the sidelines, I was in the fight. Yeah, I was in the fight, but I lost, you know. And it's good to feel the sting of defeat and the pain of defeat. And then you can get to a truer consolation much later when you understand, in the case of Orban, that I don't think there was actually, in practical terms, a way to prevent this happening. I just think if you look objectively at the situation, sometimes you lose. And it's not because you failed to do everything that you could have done. You just lose because the facts, the realities are against you. So this is the other aspect of consolation that I think is extremely interesting and is central to political life. Because half of the people who put their name on a ballot lose, and then they have to come up with a story about why they lost. Yeah. And a lot of the time, you spend your time trying to make yourself feel better about it. And sometimes I think you should make yourself feel worse.
I would like to thank Terezou Matějčková for her words about hope, because I think these words were really very interesting and very important, that even though we live in dark times, we should always try to see some hope. And it would be a big mistake to miss seeing the hope, which may be somewhere, maybe it is there, but we can't see it, or we don't look for it so much as we should. So thank you very much, Terezou. It was for me very, very interesting. Thank you.
All the way in the back.
Thank you very much for the panel. I was wondering if thinking about consolation gave you a new perspective to thinking about success. Consolation is the way that a person deals with failure, but did you learn anything about the flip side of how do we think about succeeding?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last sentence. How do I think about what?
If thinking about consolation has made you gain a new perspective about how you think about success, or how a person takes it and changes with it.
Was it a question about success? Yes. Well, I thought a very deep thought about it. I thought that success on balance is better than failure. I don't mean to make fun of the question. Success is, I think the right thing to think about success is how close it is to failure. To think how contingent it is, how it could so easily have been failure. And that, I hope, means that you're appropriately humble. And also to think about how transitory success is. But also, I think to connect to something that Teresa said about hope, which I think is very, very true. Just as you have to know true crushing failure, as I have known, in order to value success, you also have to know deep, biting, painful despair in order to know what hope is and want hope back in your life. We have to understand the truly dialectical aspect of this. And it's important to hold on to the dialectical aspect of it, because you can think of despair as pure negativity. And you can think of failure as pure negativity. But the thing I have learned out of life is the ways in which these moments of darkness are the condition of finding the light. they're what makes finding the light possible at all, and then valuing the light when you finally have it. I don't like I don't want to sound pop psychologist. I'm not that kind of person, and I would send you back to these people wiser than me. But I do think that the other thing that Teresa said that I would underline is this religious tradition of seeing hope not as a set of opinions about the future or expectations about the future. Her language is very different, and it's the Christian tradition of it as a virtue. It's very hard to think of hope as a virtue, because that implies it's a practice. You get up every day and you practice hope. You spread hope. You live in hope. It's a way of living, is I think the point. I want to hand it over to you because you started it.
No, I absolutely agree, and cannot add anything else. Yes, I think that the idea that hope is a virtue is really extremely valuable, because then you can pass as well hope on to other people, and I think hope is as well a form of, it can be I think underrate the fact that it is that people can imitate you hoping. So I hope, and I can teach others to take this stance as well. And I think, but what I want to underline with this idea is that quite often we tend to be as well here in this country extremely pessimistic, and so and I think we tend to really steal sometimes hope from other people. So at least stop doing this if you cannot teach to hope.
On success and failure, I think there are few more succinct paragraphs about this than in Havel's letter to Olga, in which he finally reconciles with his failure, as he puts it, and writes, and I paraphrase, of course, it's devilishly easy to own up to one's successes, but it's very difficult to own up to one's failures. Why? Because we tend to privatize our successes. You know, when we succeed, it's our own success, etc., etc. When we fail, we externalize our failure invariably, and Havel describes it beautifully, because his power of introspection was amazing, and he says, you know, was it my education, my politeness, my did I just want it to be clever, or was it the circumstances, etc., etc., and goes through the whole list, and then says, you know, the only hope I can have for what the Christians call grace, as he puts it, is when I internalize my failure as my own and only my own and nobody else's. Yeah, and I think that's one of the best recipes for hope I've ever read. Since there are no other questions, we will allow one more from. Oh, no. You have to give precedence to the lady.
Thank you. I was wondering, do you also think that different societies suffer differently? You know, in both like historical, political perspective, because I think like the West, the collective West, has managed to build a system that has reduced suffering if you compare it, you know, to previous or other systems. And then it's not that the suffering disappeared fully, it just changed in shape and form. And I think I'm asking this especially because my personal experience was when the full invasion of Ukraine started, I felt like in myself, you know, the two kinds of suffering sort of clashed, because I was used to one kind of suffering of our Western neurotic, you know, kind of stuff, and then you have war going on right next door, and that's something else. And then the tools for dealing with these like different kinds of suffering are also a bit different, yes? So.
I think that's a very important point, and what I take from it is that we use the word suffering for our experiences here, and then we use the same word to describe what this afternoon as I was coming in on the train, I was watching a little video of Ukrainian police evacuating elderly women from Avdiivka, which is under siege. And I think it's a essential aspect of an appropriate use of language and self-understanding not to conflate the two sufferings. That is, to understand what's absolutely specific to the suffering of this woman, who's in an absolutely devastated landscape, being asked to move, and she's in tears because she doesn't want to leave her home. And yet anybody looking at the home thinks, lady, get out of there right now, because you could die. But for her, the existential charge is completely different. And so you have to make an enormous effort to so it's not, and then the broader question, which is that suffering is experienced and felt differently in different cultures, is evidently true. That is, and any anthropologist who looks at this, you know, can tell you stories about people weeping in other cultures about things that we simply can't understand why they're crying. It's that radical. And the final thing is the historical change. When I was in Seville in October with my wife, we were in some wonderful late Baroque Spanish church with unbelievable, unspeakable plaster cast depictions of Christ's suffering and crucifixion, of a kind of morbid indulgence in suffering which made me want to scream. And clearly I couldn't enter a world in which suffering could be treasured in this slightly homoerotic, weird way. But clearly, you know, this is a whole universe of suffering which help people to bear theirs. But it's a closed world to us now, it seems to me. And so we need to historicize our own emotions and anthropologize our emotions, and then hopefully that makes us more cautious about drawing too easy comparisons between states of emotion that are actually radically different and experienced differently.
All right, I'm afraid this will be the last word. We need to finish. Já přejdu do češtiny. Musíme, nebo měli bychom skončit, ale než skončíme, tak bych rád jenom upozornil, že tuto nádhernou knihu vydalo nakladatelství Kalich a jeho šéfredaktor Michal Plzák je tady někde mezi námi, ale co je důležitější, jsou tady, a teď doufám, že to není fake news, Jsou tady, myslím, kopie této knihy k zakoupení a když budete hodně hezky prosit, a já nemůžu mluvit za Michaela Ignatěva. Takže, Michael, thank you so much. Tereza, thank you. And thank you all. You've been a wonderful audience.